The night was clear and calm, although it was bitterly cold. There was no moon, but the cloudless sky blazed with stars. The ocean was like polished glass. Sitting in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet had never seen the sea so smooth. Of a sudden, Fleet saw something in the distance. It was dark and ominous up ahead. It kept growing larger and larger. Fleet banged the crow's nest bell 3 times. He phoned the bridge. They said, "What do you see?" He said, "Iceberg dead ahead." "Thank you." And he heard nothing else. Moments later, a faint grinding jar seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the ship. Just enough to rattle the silver that had been set for the next morning's breakfast. As if nothing happened, Fleet returned to his watch from the crow's nest. John Jacob Astor, the wealthy tycoon, and his wife turned over in bed and went back to sleep. One passenger told his wife, he says, "I think we've been struck by an iceberg. But there's no danger, I've been told." Mr. Stewart, a wealthy share owner of Barnum and Bailey Circus, he hurried to the room where his friend was, Mr. and Mrs. Bishop, and he said, "Come out and let's amuse ourselves. There are tons of ice on the forward deck. Come on, let's have some fun." And men and women were playfully throwing ice at one another. Postal workers down deep in the ship, they found themselves sloshing around in water up to their knees. They joked to one another about the soaked baggage and about the floating letters. At no point could they really bring themselves to believe that anything that they saw was really dangerous. Clouds of steam gushed through the boiler room as the men sweated away, but gradually they returned to normal as Lawrence Beasley started below to his cabin. He noticed, though, that there was something different about the stairs that weren't quite right. They seemed level, yet his feet didn't fall exactly where they should. It was as though the steps were leaning toward the bow. He called out to his friend, Mr. Hayes, "She's listing. She shouldn't do that. The water is perfectly still." Mr. Hayes says, "I don't know why this boat is listing. One thing for sure, you cannot sink this boat." I'm sure by now you've guessed what I'm speaking about. The Titanic was a luxury liner, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide, 174 feet from keel to top, and 66,000 tons of steel. It was built by Harland and Wolff of Belfast, Northern Ireland, and was thought to be unsinkable. On this clear night in April of 1912, the Titanic was carrying 2,207 people, many of whom were some of the world's wealthiest. And as the ship began listing, skipper Captain Smith said, "I can't imagine any condition that would cause the ship to founder. I can't conceive of any vital disaster happening to this vessel. I mean, modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." That statement, beloved, rings with human philosophy. The idea that man has progressed now to a higher intelligence and can take care of himself. Man is indestructible. It wasn't long, however, until Captain Smith began to realize the awful truth of the matter. Water was fast filling the lower compartments, one at a time. A nearby ship, the Californian, sent a radio message about icebergs in the area, but Phillips, the radio operator on the Titanic, was busy working the Camptown races. When Captain Smith finally did radio for help, the Californian radio was off and they never received it. At exactly 12:05 in the morning, April the 15th, 1912, just 25 minutes after the bumping, grinding jar, Captain Smith ordered the chief officer to uncover the lifeboats. Trimmer Samuel Hemming climbed back into his bunk. An instant later, the boatswain appeared and said, "Turn out, you fellows, you have a half an hour to live. Keep it to yourself and let no one know." And when the life belts were handed out, one wealthy editor called it a lot of nonsense. A smelting excerpt said, magnate, he said, "This will hurt." John Jacob Astor and his wife were sitting on a pair of motionless mechanical horses wearing their life belts. and Mr. Astor had an extra one on his lap. He began slicing it open with his penknife to show his wife what was inside. As the crew moved swiftly to their stations, Officer Lowe said to them, "You must remember that we do not have too much sleep, and therefore when we sleep, we die." There were 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsibles, capable of carrying 1,178 people. A little over half of the amount that were on there. 2,207 on board on that Sunday night. This discrepancy was known by none of the passengers and few of the crew, but most of them wouldn't have cared anyway. Why worry? Because the Titanic is unsinkable. Mrs. Caldwell asked a deck on hand, "Is this ship really unsinkable?" "Why, yes, my dear lady, God himself could not sink this ship." The mother of one of the survivors had refused to board the Titanic because she had had a premonition solely based on the fact that she said to declare a vessel unsinkable was flying in the face of God. And speaking of the ship's final moments, this lady said, "I saw that ship sink. I was in all horror of its sinking, and I heard even more dreadful the cries of the drowning people." Well, the response to the lifeboats was not enthusiastic at all. I mean, why trade the bright decks of the Titanic for a few brief hours or for a few dark hours in a rowboat? And Mr. Astor ridiculed the idea. He said, "We're safer here than in that little boat." The band had assembled and they were playing ragtime. Some were persuaded to get into the lifeboats, including movie star Dorothy Gibson. The boat was warm and there seemed to be no hurry. Captain Smith ordered Quartermaster George Thomas Rowe to fire the distress rockets, one every 5 to 6 minutes. Only 10 miles away, Officer Stone of the Californian was studying the strange ship on the horizon, and at 12:45 he saw a sudden flash of light burst over her. And he was known to have said, "Strange that a ship would fire rockets at night." I've never understood that. Time was clearly running out. The women were urged to get into the lifeboats at once. A rather large lady stood crying near number 13 lifeboat. "Don't put me in that boat. I don't want to get into that boat. I've never been in an open boat in my life." The lifeboats were capable of handling 40 to 60 people. Number 1 was lowered down with exactly 12 people. Greaser Walter Hurst watched it as it was being lowered, and he said, "If they're sending the boats away, they might just as well put some people in them." Reality was now beginning to set in. Many of the passengers turned to prayer. A number of them were seen gathered in the saloon with rosaries in their hands. Out in the lifeboats, all eyes were turned upon the Titanic. Her tall mast, the 4 big funnels, stood out sharp and black in the clear night sky. From the boats they could see the people lining the rails. They could hear the ragtime in the still of the night. It seemed impossible that anything could be wrong with this ship. Yet here we are, out here in the sea, in a rowboat. And looking at the Titanic, it was well down at the head. She was brilliantly lit from stem to stern. She looked like a sagging birthday cake. Captain Smith's last words to his crew was, "Every man for himself." Some of the men jumped overboard. One survivor still sucks in deeply as he remembers the stabbing cold water. Have you ever jumped in ice cold water? I have, and I know what they're speaking of. However, most of the crew stuck with the ship. One man who was a good swimmer wanted to jump out and swim to the lifeboats in the distance. But his friend who was not a good swimmer, persuaded him not to try. The influence of doubters. How many here today have been influenced not to act upon a conviction of God because of the influence of a doubter? The bandmaster tapped his violin and the ragtime ended, and the strains of the Episcopal hymn Autumn drifted out over the water in the still night air. And the great and the unknown tumbled together in a writhing heap as the bow plunged deeper and still deeper and the stern rose higher. Adding to the heap of humanity was a jumble of falling musicians and instruments. The lights went out, flashed on one more time, and then they went out for good. Nearly 1/3 of the ship's watertight compartments were flooded. They filled like sections of an ice cube tray. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the iceberg drove a gash about 300 feet long in her starboard side at 300 feet long. The great liner tilts only a few seconds and then plunges to the bottom. Her giant stacks collapsed violently. Massive steel flanges were ripped open like the lid of a sardine can. 1-inch steel was crumpled like tin foil. She was now perpendicular and looked like a black finger pointing to the sky. One survivor says she looked like a Christmas card against a backdrop of brilliant stars. Slowly, the Titanic began to slide under at a steep glance. And as she glided down, she seemed to pick up speed. When the sea closed over the flagstaff on her stern, she was moving fast enough to cause a slight gulp. It then disappeared below the surface, leaving the lifeboats all alone in that vast expanse of ocean in the middle of the night, which seemed so desolate now. In those lifeboats were Catholics, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists. They were all jumbled together. They all compromised on the Lord's Prayer, and they called it out in chorus. But this was not the only sound that drifted out over that water. There were hundreds of swimmers crying out for help. To one man, it sounded like 100,000 fans at a British Football Cup final. To Jack Thayer from Pennsylvania, it sounded like a high-pitched drum of locusts on a midsummer's night in the woods back home in Pennsylvania. In number 1, with 12 in the lifeboat, fireman Charles Hendrickson, he said, "It's up to us to go back and pick up anyone in the water." There was silence. Lookout George Simons, in charge of the boat, made no move. Then when the suggestion came again to help the swimmers, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon announced he didn't think we should try. It would be too dangerous. The boat would be swamped. And with that, the subject was dropped. And boat number 1 with 12 people, made for 40 or more, rowed on aimlessly in the dark. The cries grew fainter. They refused to listen to the cries of the lost. I know you know where I'm going with this, don't you, beloved? The cries grew fainter. What about us? Are the cries getting fainter? Do we listen to the cries and are afraid to help those who are lost in sin? Do we condition ourselves? Do I condition myself not to hear their cries anymore? Of the 1,502 people who went down on the Titanic, only 13 were picked up by the 18 boats that hovered nearby. That's less than 1 per boat. The realization that close friends were lost forever had not sunk in. A curiously tranquil feeling came over many of those in the boats. Beloved, does a knowledge of the lost and dying about us stir our innermost soul? Arguing over trifles began to break out in some of the boats. Can you imagine that? Uncomfortable, all kinds of trifling things they would argue about. Do we as a church argue over trifles? While the world is perishing without Christ all around us? Tearing the church apart over who is to be ordained or who is not to be ordained while souls are perishing all around us? Are you with me? It's so silly. When the Carpathia finally came to the rescue, there was wild excitement in the lifeboats, and rightly so. Beloved, 2,000 years ago, Jesus came to our rescue, and we need to get excited about it. Amen. We need also to get excited about our commission in rescuing those who are lost in sin. I see the Titanic as our world today, with all its pleasures. I can see man's attitude in the statement that was made that God himself cannot sink this ship. There are certain entities within our denomination that say God himself is not going to stop us. Beloved, today man is in a stupor, thinking the world will continue on and nobody and nothing is going to change it. In 1 Peter or 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, you know the text, knowing this, that scoffers will come in the last day, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Like Phillips, there on the Titanic, listening to the Camptown races, are our immediate pleasures more important than the threat to human life from the devil's icebergs? Are we more interested in some of the things that we get caught up in and forget about the people all around us that are dying? I'm talking to Dan Shafer. Just as the people on the Titanic played with ice on the deck, America's people are playing with the ominous signs of the end of the world. Those scoffing at God's holy word are flying in the face of God. When Elder Wilson was embattled here just a few weeks ago and persecuted by those selfish, unconverted dissidents, they were flying in the face of God. On board the Titanic, there didn't seem to be any hurry when the warnings came. Life went on as usual. Many did not get into the lifeboats because they'd never been in a little boat before in open water. They had never exercised their faith before. They responded to the situation as they should have been expected to respond. You know, we don't live a life of indifference, unconcern, or selfishness, lazy faith, and expect to be prepared to perform when the big test comes. Just ain't going to be. Jeremiah chapter 5. Come with me there on that one. I want you to come with me on that. Jeremiah chapter 5. And verse 12. The prophet here is speaking of God's judgments upon Israel for their perverseness. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 12. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 12. They have lied about the Lord. They said he will do nothing. No harm will come to us. We will never see sword or famine. Here we can see God's people here at the time of the captivity denying the prophetic message that had warned them of the impending doom. And on the other hand, the messages of the false prophets promising peace and security for the nation was eagerly accepted by these sin-loving people. You see, the promise of peace and security. This ship is unsinkable. Even God himself could not sink this ship. Why, this organization is unsinkable. This was the attitude of those on board the Titanic on that cold night of April 1912, a little bit before my time. So it will be in the closing moments of this earth's history. 1,500 people, 1,502 people lost their lives on that fateful night. Beloved, this church, organized under the inspiration of God, is a lifeboat in an iceberg-filled sea of this world. And it is our responsibility to rescue the dying. We have conditioned ourselves to not hear the cries anymore. Have we become apathetic? Have we become indifferent? This old world is listing at the bow. The rockets of despair are going up. Lifeboats are being readied. Its inhabitants are playing with the ice. There are the rich, there are the proud, there are the doubters, playing our ragtime. Scoffers are plenty. And we hear the cries and all the waters all around us. This world is flying in the face of God. Beloved, time is running out. The iceberg has struck this earth and the end is imminent. From under the molten rock of Pompeii was discovered as a solidified testimony to future generations. People were found clutching their money boxes. One woman was holding on to 2 pearl earrings. Judgment Day reveals what is really important to people. But our God is going to touch it all soon. He's going to touch it all. And those who have compromised with the world, who have compromised with their employer, who have compromised with their children, yes. Those who have had more faith in what the world can do for them than what they had and what God could do for them are going to have experienced they're going to have a sad experience. What will they do then? What will they do then? When the plants of our mighty cities have turned out their last finished work, when the merchants have sold their last yardage and have dismissed their last hired clerk, when our banks have raked in the last dollar and paid out their last dividend, when the judge of earth says close for the night and asks for a balance, what then? When the choir has sung its last anthem and the preacher has made his last sermon and the sound has died out on the air, when the Bible lies closed on the altar and the pews are all empty of men and each one stands facing his record and the book is open, what then? When the actor has played his last drama and the mimic has made his last pun, when the film has flashed its last picture and the scoreboard displayed its last run, when the crowds seeking pleasure have vanished and gone out in the darkness, what then? When the culture-sensitive religionists, are you listening to me? When the culture-sensitive religionists stands before God's great tribunal to give an answer, what then? Beloved, the only thing that will count for you and for me on that great day of reckoning will be our relationship with Jesus Christ. Whether we have believed in His Word and His warning message for these last days, our hearts should burn within ourselves to persuade as many people as possible to get into the lifeboats, because this world thinks it is unsinkable. And we know better, don't we? And the lifeboat, of course, is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I wonder, do we have the song, Nearer My God to Thee? Is that in our hymnal? Why don't we close with that song before I have our closing prayer for this afternoon? And I leave that challenge with each of us, including myself, that before it's ever too late.
473.
473? In the red? Okay. Others say it was autumn. We don't know what it was, but it's immaterial. That's right. Yes. Nearer, my God, to Thee. Nearer to Thee. E'en though it be a cross that raiseth me, still